So going back to last week, we asked the question, why? Why do we need to talk about this, learn about this at all? And we talked about how big and just ridiculous God's plan is for the church. He says in Ephesians 1, verses 9 and 10, God made known to us the mystery of his will to bring unity to all things in heaven and on earth under Christ. So we talked about how huge of a ridiculous thing is that none of us are, capable of doing. But then also there's this piece that takes it to our personal level in Ephesians 3, verses 16 and 19. Paul writes, I pray that out of his glorious riches he may strengthen you with power through his Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. And I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power, together with all the Lord's people, to grasp how wide and how long and how high and deep is the love of Christ, and to know this love that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of Christ. So you see there at the end, that last part of the verse, that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. So if we as individuals making up the church that's supposed to help God as he partners with us to bring unity between heaven and earth, it's going to require us as individual disciples to be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. And Paul writes here beautifully what's at the core of making that happen, and it's being rooted and established in love, to grasp how wide and how long, just how much God actually loves us. So going from there, after the vision and mission, we talked a little bit about these two different models of church, with what you would call a traditional model on the left and how it compares to a more missional model shown on the right, and how the numbers in the middle represent the number of people, 10 staff people, 100 volunteers, 1,000 members or spectators or attenders. But then on the left here, you see no one's reaching directly the 10,000 people that might be in their community that this church is trying to reach. And so they rely on a strategy of just inviting people to come to church, and just trying to make it attractive to them in great ways, just having great worship music, having great teaching, putting on really cool events, and attracting them to come to church. Whereas in a missional model, you have equippers as staff, either paid or not paid, equipping leaders and church planters to go out as missionaries, and in these micro communities or missional communities at the bottom, directly reaching, going out of the church to reach those 10,000 people in various ways. We also talked about fractals. And so this picture is a picture of a fractal snowflake. And this is actually how snowflakes are formed. And it's this idea that a very simple structure can multiply and multiply over and over and become this beautiful and complex thing. And that's how I believe God designed his church to grow and multiply. But it starts with this very simple core thing. And we talked about what makes up that. So we talked last week about the 3 ecclesial minimums. What are the essentials of what is church? And then thinking of it in a fractal way, how do these things relate to us as individuals? As individual disciples, we are called to do these things, these 3 things: to worship, be in community, and be on mission. And then together, collectively, as communities, we're to do these 3 things as well. And if we do those together, that's a church. So it's this simple idea to what it is that that constitutes a church, what's required, and what are those essentials that will replicate, multiply over time to make something more beautiful and complex. Then lastly, last week we talked about this missionary pathway. How does this all happen over time? Talked about disciples living like missionaries and planting the gospel in their network of relationships. New disciples are formed. A microchurch emerges out of that. Leaders within that microchurch are developed to multiply, and that core micro expression multiplies and multiplies. All being dependent on extraordinary prayer and fasting for any of it to have any chance of success.